Welcome to the Rodcast with Rod Turner, the show all about real estate. We discuss everything that affects asset-backed businesses, investments, and go deep into the details with some of the best in the business.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Rodcast. Today I'm very excited because my guest is none other than the founder of SaveTheHighStreet.org, Together Futures and Thriver. And he is here today to talk about the High Street. Welcome, Alex Schlagman. How are you?
Thanks for having me, Rod.
Great to have you. So, Alex, what do you see as the biggest challenges for the UK High Street?
Yeah. I mean, the interesting start point here is that some of the biggest challenges are actually, ironically, some of its great opportunities as well. So we've talked and read in the media how many times about the death of the high street because of e-commerce, because of the internet. And we're rolling out all kinds of competitions at the moment, particularly focused around shopping centres to look for next generation tenants. And indexing higher than any other category are digital first brands, online only retailers looking to come onto the high street. Empty space, another major challenge. We can all see it as we walk up and down high streets and shopping centres. But at a high street level, at a market level, this is a fantastic opportunity to regenerate high streets from the bottom up. Start getting the right businesses in the right places, doing the right things. You know, we talk internally, our side, a lot about artificial intelligence at the moment, and it's one of the great technology shifts going on, but it's also very scary, and scary for a lot of people, both in terms of what their role will be in work for the future, what does this mean for the future of their industry, but we're deploying all kinds of things at the moment that present great opportunities for high streets. So I think there's a double-edged sword to some of the really most talked about challenges on high streets today.
Okay, and so beyond retail, what other sectors are crucial for a thriving high street?
Yeah. I mean, so when we look at high streets, product retail, I'm assuming you're talking about here, is only one component part of the high street offer. And interestingly, when we think about future high streets, future town centres, even future shopping centres, we think about much more. Let's start with the grounding of what is it that people actually need in this centre. And in some cases, it's definitely not as much retail as it was in the past. It may be other more comparable uses that are sometimes classed within when people talk about retail, such as F&B, leisure, new kind of uses like competitive socializing coming in quite a lot at the moment, you know, but also what are the needs for wider uses in our town centres? And in some cases, the best way to save some high streets is to shrink the retail and actually create more commercial uses, other commercial uses around the edges, and even residential.
So what would be some examples of those commercial uses?
Yeah, flexible workspace, last mile logistics. I mean, data centers people talk about a lot, maybe less use in the town center. But when you're right next to the end consumer, you know, what are the things that we want and expect in the places that we live, work, and play?
And I think that kind of sums it up, because I always think of high street or shopping centres as being, in terms of demand, as being kind of, where do I want to go on a rainy Saturday afternoon? And in the 90s, you kind of, I guess it was kind of pubs, and then you had the coffee shops and gyms, and then you already mentioned kind of that competitive socializing aspect now. And I guess it's kind of what's the next trend to go there? Because if I walk down a typical high street in London, I'll see coffee shop after coffee shop, I'll see barbers, and I'll see estate agents. And now we're starting to see some of these other things, like you've got obviously the exercise stuff like Pilates and gyms, but also like your virtual reality kind of experience-led stuff. So is that what you're finding as well?
Yeah, we're seeing, and we're running these, as I said, these competitions, but we're also supporting a lot of high street brands at every stage of the journey, from startups to scale-ups. And we're seeing a whole range of different high street offerings emerging. Some are basically plays on the old.
Yeah.
Florists done well, you know. It doesn't necessarily have to be reinvent the rule books, but actually, how could you do a butcher's shop done well? Another one we've been looking at recently. How do you build the right processes, the right operating model to build a scale up in a category where it's very fragmented?
You've got to make butchers sexy again.
Hey, make butchers sexy again. But no, in other cases, it is very much about saying, well, what are the interesting trends? You talk about sort of VR. Yes, definitely. You know, we've been we're looking at putting a VR kind of proposition in one of the centres that we're working within. But, you know, there's a whole range of others. There's a whole range of other things that people, you know, want to do to creatively make use of physical space, which is really what we're talking about here.
Yeah, so, I mean, we've talked about death of the high street, but give us some of those examples of those success stories or pockets of resilience that you've kind of seen on the high street then, and shopping centres.
Yeah, I mean, just talking from our first-hand experiences here, because we've been rolling out a range of what we call incubators in different shopping centres around the UK over the last 6 months. So, you know, an example might be down in Southend, where there were 6 vacant units lined up next to each other that had been lying vacant for over 5 years. Over 5 years, not been let. And we opened up a competition basically to attract the next generation of high street entrepreneurs around Southend. We had 250 businesses applied.
Wow.
Those businesses won a short period of rent-free space, and they go on to Thriver, which is our kind of all-in-one support platform that's powered from the ground up by AI, that helps them build their business at the same time.
So that helps with the back office kind of roles that you typically... sometimes we associate small businesses being very good at kind of the front end stuff, but not great at the back end stuff. So is that the idea that you're taking care of that or helping them along with that?
Yeah, and I'll come back to the incubator examples in a second. But yeah, with Thriver, you know, ultimately this is addressing the major pain point we'd seen at Save the High Street building over the years on the inside of the businesses themselves, which is small high street entrepreneurial businesses almost across the board are very good and still passionate about the trade, whether that's cutting your hair, cooking your food, making the product. No problems there whatsoever. And actually, I think most people from even listening in as consumers will agree that the quality standard that they expect from an independent coffee shop, a boutique, a hairdresser, whatever it might be, is usually there. Yeah. Where they fall down is that unlike a big business that has teams of people, budgets, consultancies, everything in each different department, whether that's marketing, financial management, HR, store expansion, all of these different areas that a big high street brand will have, a small business has none of this. So the entrepreneur is expected to wear all of these hats. And us and other people who'd been there trying to help small businesses get through this came to the same conclusion, that you're not going to be able to build a scalable kind of agency offering for the small businesses. They don't have enough money to be able to pay for the kind of support that big brands pay for. So the answer had to lie, in our view, around technology. We had to find a way to create the feeling of having a whole team without the cost of a whole team. And so for us, the last couple of years really opened the door to the possibility of effectively building a team of AI agents for every single small business. And so what Thriver is effectively doing is it's building towards a future where small businesses can focus on the things they're good at, and everything else at the click of a button can be done by Thriver with a marginal cost in most cases of the individual jobs of less than a penny.
Wow.
So it's kind of extraordinary what's going on at the moment with artificial intelligence generally, and particularly around what we call agentic AI, which are, you know, these opportunities for the AI to start to feel like co-pilots or new team members that work alongside you and ramp you up. And so for us, this is a big deal, not just around the economics of building small businesses and turning them into bigger businesses, but even the experience. as a small business owner, and I'm sure there's a lot of people listening in their own business, it's so easy to get stuck in the things that you know you're not the best at and that you know you don't love doing. And as a result, it gets harder and harder to get up in the morning when things aren't easy.
Well, we always say that we put every task that you do into a category, and it's either high value for the business, something you bloody love doing, or something that no one else can do 80% as good as you do if you outsource it. And everything you do in your business really should tick 2 out of 3 of those boxes. And if it's not, that's the first thing that then gets outsourced and someone else can do it. And,
exactly.
And that's kind of where I guess your AI is coming in, because you want to be doing what you're good at and what you love and what's high value.
And you know, it's just extraordinary seeing the scope of things that can already be done. I mean, you're using at the moment, whatever you're using, with your small business using Thriver today, or whether you're just a consumer playing around with ChatGPT, this is the worst version of the AI you're ever going to use. And as it stands today, Thriver's working across 143 of the key essential jobs that small businesses need to do. And these jobs range from creating a financial forecast, to creating a job advert, to creating an email newsletter, to creating each different component parts of a new business plan without the cost of humans.
Fantastic.
Entirely personalized to your business.
Wow. 978 Finance is a whole of market brokerage. We specialise in the difficult deals. Are you struggling to finance your development? Do you need bridging? Maybe a hunter facility? Or have you got a complex structure? Or do you just need some buy-to-let finance? If you do, please contact 978finance.com. And so go back to the incubator success stories then. Tell us a little bit about those.
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting one, because there's the thing that really struck us when we started really kicking on with these incubators is that there's just so much entrepreneurial energy in every single town centre and city centre we move into. So in Southend was the example we were talking about here. 250 businesses applied in less than a month for the opportunity to launch their brand into the Victoria Centre in Southend. Now, from that, we have effectively built a model now where we can assess the hundreds or, different businesses that apply and select the ones that have the best curation fit for the centre and trying to get the right offerings together to create a better overall proposition for the consumer, as well as who are these entrepreneurs, whatever stage they're at. Sometimes they're not pure startup. They might be moving on to their 2nd, 3rd, 4th stores or restaurants. But who are the entrepreneurs that, with the right support around them, have the best chance of taking this incubation period and turning it into a long-term lease license agreement with the landlord? So what we're looking here is saying, well, if you can't fill the units using the conventional way, why don't we just get the word out at scale, get everybody who's interested to apply for the opportunity to try it out before they make that long-term commitment, and then wrap around that each one of those businesses the perfect amount of support for them to give them a chance to achieve their potential in that particular space. And as you get to the end of those spaces, we help build a kind of an open source investment case that everyone's got visibility of, so that landlords, tenant, agents who may be involved can all see, what is the case for this business to move on to different types of commercial arrangements on the longer term. And so what we've seen here is Guildford, Southend, now Edgware, now Devon, these incubators that are rolling out in different shopping centres, is that A, tons of entrepreneurial energy. B, when we roll these competitions out, there's loads of goodwill, which for a shopping centre. And then at the end of this, we're finding that the businesses don't want to leave.
Yeah,
you find the right businesses, you put them in there, you give them a shot, you put support around them, they're in a situation they want to stay. So deals are being done. So people are finding this is a path to sustained occupancy for empty space. And I think that's a really interesting kind of very specific example of interventions that haven't been done historically in this way, that actually can help take, like we said at the beginning, the big challenge facing high street empty shops and turning it into whole new, fresh offerings coming into the centre that are, giving the people what they want.
And you mentioned before potentially shrinking high streets, also residential. I mean, are then these mixed-use developments, are they the way forward for the high street, do you think?
No, I think there's a category of empty space. When we look at it, we don't call it an incubator because it's so big, we call it an anchor. Because actually, you do something really interesting with this space. You create a destination out of an empty ex-department store, for example.
Gravity and Debenhams and all that kind of
All
stuff.
kind, exactly. But in these big spaces here, we're looking at one the other week. It's a 215,000 square foot of empty space over 5 floors. There isn't a single occupier out in the market at the moment that's just actively looking for these spaces anymore. BHS is not taking space from Debenhams, and House of Fraser isn't taking space from BHS.
Yeah.
As we know, people may know today, this week, the last Beals store closed. So these big, historic department store type propositions, and even the brands that were taking very big spaces, particularly in the town shopping centres, they're not active. So we've got to do interesting, different things with those spaces. Now, when I look at those spaces, intuitively, in a lot of town centres, you don't even have to get deep into the data to validate. You might want to validate it, but to get a feel that you're not going to fill this full of loads more retail, because we've actually got a high street offer around it all, and the catchment's not big enough, and we are where we are as in terms of the market cycle. So you've got to start to think about how to intelligently repurpose some of that space into other uses that do fit the needs of that particular town centre. And in some cases, it can be as far as resi, but there's lots of other commercial uses that fit quite coherently in these kind of mixed-use destinations, without it feeling strange. Actually, this is what these things should look like: event spaces and flexible workspace baked into these very large empty units that are transformed.
So from an investment perspective now, what approaches are being done to revitalise high streets and shopping centres? Because it's all well and good sort of saying, hey, let's create something new, but you've got to have the capital to put in there, and really what that capital needs is a return. So what's happening at the moment from that point of view?
Okay, so I'll look at this from a couple of different sides. So firstly, like the kind of underlying secret on the inside, there are people making a lot of money in retail property at the moment, but it's in certain areas. And so some people who've had the right access and have the right capital have done very well buying primary shopping centres in second-tier locations. So yields have been absolutely nuts because, especially where there were void challenges and those were priced in, if you actively asset manage some of these centres that weren't being very actively sweat, if you like, really pushed to the max, suddenly you're turning these things into really kind of high performing, lots of capital appreciation, basically, taking things that were not maximizing their income potential and just making sure they do. First thing. Secondly, when we talk about these like empty department stores, huge delta, between what the price in the market would be versus what it could be once you've got those assets generating income again, anywhere near what they could be doing. So there's a huge delta there. The challenge is actually, now that we've built what we've built, and what we've been trying to do here at Save the High Street is let's not just talk about the conceptual. Everyone can do that. We've been really interested in how do we change the economics about making things happen that we all know should happen. How do we change the economics of building a high street business? How do we change the economics of filling empty space that's hard to fill? These kind of examples. And so when we look at that side, we know we've got part of the equation solved, actually, as we sit here in May 2025, and we're only getting better at that when it comes to attracting lots of small businesses, making small businesses successful and stay, keeping space occupied, generating income from lots of smaller entrepreneurial businesses. Great. But the other side of the coin here is that some of these big spaces where there is, on paper, it looks like it's unbelievable opportunity, and lots of people have explored it around department stores being empty, is physically transforming the space. And so one thing we've been doing here is working alongside some of the more experienced operator partners that we've got in the industry, people that have built some of the more successful food markets, for example, some of the early food market operators. Someone in my team was part of the founding team of Pop Brixton and Peckham Levels. One of my other partners was launched the first Mercato Metropolitano, and helped them launch, move to Mayfair. And one thing we've been looking at here is, can we take some of the principles that we've been deploying at Save the High Street, which are much more meanwhile use driven? You know, we come from that space more. How do we take over like the empty Debenhams we did in Hounslow and turn it into the Loft? And how do we do that in 3 weeks and get it open? You know, and then how do you run it as a 1-year project before the landlord takes vacant possession using some mayoral funding? That's where our experience come from. So we come from a different standpoint here. And I live in W2 near Queensway, where amazing development, very excited to see it all open up with the Whiteleys. But it's been running for years and years and years and years. How do we get somewhere that's a nice fit in the middle? Yeah. Because some of these projects that we're talking about where there's a huge delta of upside, actually do require quite a lot of work. And so while we can do very little with needing to get rid of asbestos when it needs to get rid of, what we can start to think is, can we make places cool and good enough and more dynamic and flexible in the design, modular, flexible, dynamic design, without going in with the humongous fit outs and the humongous capex that's put into, high-end restaurants and department stores of old, and even department stores that are well underway at the moment and being transformed.
So you mentioned kind of mayoral subsidies or whatever it was there. Like, what role do local authorities play in regeneration? And have there been any successful models of kind of local authorities working on their high streets or shopping centres?
Yeah, I mean, look, every local authority has a role to play. In fact, it's wider than that. There's so many stakeholders in this industry that create successful high streets. Save the High Street, we're about changing high streets for the better. That's what we're fundamentally about. And actually, that's a mission that a lot of people are on. A lot of people listening in today will be actually doing their little bit to make that happen as well. But a local authority's got a big role in their local area. They've got a number of different hats that they wear, which is part of the challenge sometimes with a local authority, because they've got teams like regeneration and economic development, but then they've also got planning and they've also got enforcement teams. And so when you're thinking about your local authority, there's a whole bunch of different teams with different motives trying to do different things. And sometimes they're not always even pulling in the same direction. So they're not always best set up, but there's always, in every local authority we've ever worked with, individuals, particularly in certain parts of the authority that we've been closer to, who are incredibly motivated to try and make as much impact as possible with the resources they've got. Now, some of the things that we're doing quite tactically with these local authorities are, for example, the incubators we were talking about, which are typically private sector led. In some areas, we've got local authorities we're either exploring, and we're actually piloting some stuff in the West Country at the moment, where the local authority has taken a lead position with us, where there is a vacancy challenge on a fragmentedly owned high street. Very common thing in the UK. Most high streets aren't just singularly owned by one major landlord. We're sitting in the West End of London today, where bits of West End are, the Grosvenor, or you've got the Crown Estate. You've got different major owners to own in big bunch, but a lot of it's very fragmentedly owned. So there, the local authority has taken a very important coordination role, where they brought us in, provided some resources to us to go out there and engage every single local landlord with vacant space in their town centre, get them on board so that they just have to provide the empty space, provide the resources to us to go run a big competition to find the next generation of entrepreneurs and incubate them all using Thriver. And so it becomes a public-private sector partnership, but it was actually the local authority that was needed to stimulate that. In other cases, the local authority is applying for different types of funding, which are focused around either long-term regeneration projects or shorter-term kind of how can we have an impact in the near term. And we've got local authorities like in Ashfield and Mansfield now rolling Thriver out for their local businesses. You know, they agreed to do that. The next week we're on it. We're getting going with it. In other projects, they've secured a huge amount of capital funding to be able to actually take more of a charge around the physical transformation of either the public realm or particular priority assets in that town centre. Now, we can have a view about how well some of those things have been done, but I can say on the inside here is that the people who are trying to make those projects happen are doing this in good faith and trying to do this. It's defining their careers in some cases, these big capital projects. And one of the challenges I think we've seen from, you know, some of the funding streams that have come through. So there was a series of quite substantial funding that came at the end of the Conservative government period. And some of those projects are just getting started. So it's going to be a little bit early to tell on some of these bigger capital projects. And I think one of the challenges some of those authorities probably faced is that they put too much into the long-term projects. So everybody looks at high streets going, what are you doing now? And they're like, well, we put everything into a 5-year vision, but we're in a market that's changing so much.
Yeah. And actually, by the time it gets to that 5 year, it may be non-applicable. Yeah. Okay. And I mean, how can you bring community feel back into the high street then? What if you were kind of the head of the local authority, what would you be saying we need to do to bring that community feel back in?
Yeah. So I think there's a few things. I think they've got to get really purposeful with the big challenges that are facing high streets today and build dynamism into the interventions that they're doing, to the point you were just making before things change. Now, what does that mean? So how do we identify those key champions, we call them, in the industry, we call them local leaders, local champions in the business community and in the wider community that are already trying to make a bit of a stand and have an impact in the places that they love, and empower those people more because they're everywhere. When Save the High Street launched, you know, we didn't know exactly what was going to happen, you know, but it went into a lot of the major newspapers in the first weekend, and there was a flood of support from what we now call local champions, as well as local business owners and other people who've got some vested interest in high streets. But particularly the majority weren't high street business owners, you know, and if they were more than a high street business owner. They were a community champion, trying to make a difference in the places that they love. And actually, we need to do more to help those people have the impact that they're trying to have or envision that they should be able to have. And so one of the things that we've been doing here is identifying those key leaders in the business community and helping them form independent trader associations. Because business improvement districts exist on a number of high streets, but it's never going to work for everybody. And most high streets around the UK will never, and town centres will never have a business improvement district. But you do need a collaborating and a convening force to be that kind of voice to the local authority, but to also to get everybody working together as a unit in the same way a shopping centre would. You need to actually start to think, hey, look, we've got one broader offer to consider here, which is our high street proposition, and how are we building that brand and how are we doing things in a joined up way to attract and retain consumers.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I guess the name of the game is footfall as well for these people. And you talked about kind of AI, especially with Thriver and what you're doing there to help businesses. But is there any tech out there that's really helping with the footfall aspect?
Yeah, I mean, so there's been a number of attempts at building things like local loyalty platforms, shopping marketplaces. In fact, David and I, one of the other founding partners at Save the High Street, before we launched Save the High Street, launched Pocket High Street, which was envisioning building like the Amazon for the high street, you know, one place where you could shop from all the local businesses. And we ended up evolving from there in our direction with Save the High Street and now HelloThriver.com, you know, and how we feel we can have the biggest impact. But after we started at this point in the journey, a number of other people also came on the journey and said, do you know what, conceptually, wouldn't it be amazing if you could shop from all the local businesses in one place, click and collect from everybody, have a shopping list waiting for you in the local store of all the items that you've reserved to go try on and check out, have 1 hour delivery, couriers connected in, picking things up, dropping things off. So there's a series of, unfortunately, businesses that haven't made it building that proposition, who've all either pivoted, in some cases built successful businesses, gone in different directions, but in no case has built this one layer of how do I shop from all my local businesses from one place. And still today, I call up anyone listening in, if you still have that idea, come to me, but come to me with a consumer growth hack, because that's where they all fall down. I can help bring the businesses, and we can talk to you about the technical challenges of building something like that. But those kind of things conceptually make a lot of sense. Loyalty platforms similarly. And so some people have gone in straight, how do we sell straight to the businesses and build a big consumer marketplace? Other people have gone through business improvement districts and local authorities and tried to sell it in centrally there. But in no cases has it really made a massive dent where it's like, this is defining success on this high street. There are certain places where more organic grassroots initiatives have an impact. You read about things like the Bristol Pounds and things like that, where certain communities come together and they have a real interest in kind of local independent business that's going on and people get behind it. And I think that's often what it takes. It takes almost like a movement on your high streets to have that impact. But it's possible to do that.
Okay. And what kind of practical tips would you give to investors looking to invest in their high street at the moment?
Well, look, it depends on what's your kind of interest. So if you're interested in getting a bit more actively involved, people are probably on this podcast talked a lot about HMOs, but what about the CMO, the commercial version of that? There's a lot of units, they may not be ex-department stores, Debenhams, but they're big units that could be cut up into smaller units that could allow people to commercially trade from. Now, it's going to take a little bit of extra asset management type activity and active management of the unit. But, there are people out there making really good returns on that side of things. And we want to be helpful in enabling those to exist on a longer tail level. Because, quite frankly, these kind of mixed-use, multi-tenant spaces, we believe will exist on even the smallest of town centres. Yeah. They'll just be at different scales.
Well, that was my next question, is what will the future of high streets look like? And I'm getting from you that it's very much that side of things.
Yeah, so, I mean, look, I think there's going to be if we look towards the future here, the sort of the big shapes we're trying to put in place, it's going to be much easier to start businesses. And it's going to be much easier to not just get going, but to turn ideas that work into scalable businesses. And we're really positive about this. Right? We're very excited about the impact that agentic AI is already having in May 2025, and we're just getting started. So I'm very clear that actually it's going to be easier to build businesses in the future. And I think because of partly some of the challenges that have been faced in the market, I think we'll find a way to get the risk-reward relationship between landlord and tenant to a point where turnover rents are not penalised by lenders, right? And that actually the income upside, there'll be much more intelligence around the analytics of what businesses are expected to achieve, and that actually there will be really quite significant upside opportunities for landlords that take on a little bit of risk on these hybrid models.
It was interesting what you said earlier about kind of your landlords might or investors might need to do a bit more asset management. Yeah. And I think long gone are the days of these kind of 20-year retail leases and things like that. And it is very much now your tired landlords are leaving that market because you do need to be a lot more active and operational in what you're doing. Would you agree with that?
I agree with that, and that presents an opportunity. Yeah. So and we've seen it. This is what I'm saying. So I told you at the beginning of this conversation, there were people making some really quite significant amounts of money. It's just not as public as you'd imagine, you know. And a lot of that's because people are saying, well, a lot of this market was owned by, in some cases, like, institutional capital that, wasn't quite as proactively asset managing some of this as new entrants felt that they could. And you take that down a level, not just talking about bigger shopping centres and retail parks, but actually down to, the long tail of kind of high street property ownership, and the same can apply. You may not be able to get a 20-year lease on an upward-only rent review. You may not be able to get that. But what you can get is you can get people who are willing to come in on more dynamic or flexible lease or even license terms and actually pay a premium as a result of this. So there is a lot of money. There's a lot of income to be made.
You just got to manage it right.
You just got to manage it right. And again, it gets back to what I said before. It's about the economics of managing it as well. So for us, the thing that gets for us, it sounds boring, but it gets us is actually the nuts and the bolts of actually just making things happen more cost effectively now.
And what metrics then should investors be watching to identify viable high street opportunities?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, I think for me, the stuff that gets me really interested in this market is where there is a town centre where there is void challenges. But it's a town centre where it looks like it has a case to be still a primary centre in the future. There's still a reason for this to be a place. It won't be a second or tertiary centre. It'll be a primary centre, even in the regions. There will likely, as a result of that, already be a commitment from local authorities to get behind it. But getting under that, it's more qualitative, but getting under that commitment to what is planned here, both in terms of not just high street focused funding, but also just the wider town centre funding. Are there 10,000 student homes being planned? What is the plan for the catchment generally over that period there? And then if there are units that are vacant today, it may be a function of the fact that we're going through this evolution at the moment about how we basically get the market working and get things rented at the right level. So I don't think that is a long-term thing in the right centre, but it probably will be priced in that they are finding it very hard to fill that space. So actually, depending on what your interests are, as I said, so you might be tracking different things depending on what you're looking for here. But if you're willing to make bets in the market and you're willing to get a little bit actively involved, finding town centres outside of maybe your usual purview, where it looks like this is going to be a major destination centre for that particular region for the long term. There's a commitment from local authority as well as maybe wider private sector development going on to improve the general offer, but also improve the general catchment. Is it moving up market or is it getting bigger? And if there's a void challenge there, that usually presents an opportunity.
Okay, interesting. And are there any kind of common mistakes then going on the other side of that conversation? Are there common mistakes that you see investors make when they are investing in high street property? Maybe
it is just going back to the same point you've been making here, is just expecting it to be really easy. Expecting your tenant to be there for the long term, even if they're on a lease, they might not be, and then you have to get active with doing stuff. Expecting the commercial agency model to work really well at the moment. And there's a lot of great commercial agents out there, and it's more of a systemic problem actually. We've seen here is that the agents aren't recognised or rewarded the same as if you go to the States, for example. So they're not being incredibly proactive, and they're just being quite reactive to the demand that's already coming in for a unit that they're advertising in the old-fashioned ways. Whereas actually you've got to get out there and be way more proactive. The stuff we're doing with these incubators, we're building like a little local mini movement on the high street in Southend. We're creating a viral campaign for everybody to spread the word about a competition. And obviously the agents aren't rewarded enough to make that possible on a 10% fee. So, you've got to, if you're going into this market, you've got to have a strategy and a bit of a likely commitment that you're going to get quite active with it. You're not going to just sit back and expect it to be an easy, passive ride.
No, I think that's fantastic advice. What emerging trends do you believe might have a significant impact on the high street and shopping centres going forward?
Well,
Obviously, you've mentioned the AI.
I mean, like AI's. I mean, AI's just we're just on the
Impact
cusp
on
of-
everything, really.
Yeah,
isn't
so
it?
I think I believe we're on the cusp of almost an industrial revolution level shift in the future of work unfolding in front of us at the moment, and that has implications in lots of different ways as well. If we're not doing the same jobs that we used to do, what do we do? How do we get purpose? Maybe that's not this year, but we're talking about trends.
Yeah.
These things can come quicker than we realize in some cases. So there is a consumer impact, but the stuff I was thinking about more in relation to the broad trends, relate a little bit more to, it got me thinking about what happened when we hit the pandemic, and we went into the pandemic and we came out the pandemic, and actually we've spent, the last few years in our new era. We'll go back and study this sort of post-pandemic era, and I think we're still a little bit shell-shocked as a society.
Definitely.
Yeah. I think we all prefer to have a quiet night in more than we used to. And it has had an impact on the night economy in a lot of places. But I think there's a very clear signal, and we get people. We're a bit of an echo chamber sometimes because we're hearing this from so many people all the time. But people want to get out and about. You talk about footfall being a key measure here. People want reasons to go and spend time, not even just money, in their town centres. At all walks of the economy as well. Every demographic.
Isn't it funny? Because you talked there about purpose and what people want to do. I mean, you talk about kind of anchors to your day. I know that if I do a few things in a day, it's normally everything else kind of falls into line, and I have a decent day, and I go to bed thinking, yeah, that was a good day, and I get that sense of accomplishment. And one of those things is actually getting outside.
Yeah.
And the other thing is meeting people face to face, which, again, you talked about the pandemic, and we've realised that actually how important that is to have that physical human interaction with other people, not just on a screen, but actually get out and see people. It's so important, isn't it?
Completely. Yeah. And high streets have a much bigger context than just the places we buy products and services.
Yeah.
The places we interact in the real world, they're real kind of powerhouses for local economies, but they have this wider kind of community impact, and you sometimes don't even realize it if you're going about your day, that actually people very close to you really rely on the high streets in a very kind of fundamental way for their emotional challenges that they get through as well, like you're talking about here. And so I think we will start to see the evolution of the thinking of what high street is, away from just being about buying things to being these, if you like, these town, convening points that give people reasons to come in, do things, activate them, and as a result, they may not even go away with something in their hand. But we're seeing a lot of the brands that we're helping launch into high streets, these, I said to you earlier on, the digital first brands that are launching into high streets, they're not necessarily looking to go and pile up loads of product on the shelves. They're looking to create a space that really brings their brands and activates their brand to light, and actually is much more entertaining. So we talk a lot about the experience high street and how we create reasons on an individual storefronts that are to the entire high street of being effectively an entertainment offer. And how you get people there, and as a byproduct of getting people there, you're creating value for those businesses in a lot of cases, and in a number of cases, the people will convert into having a coffee, having a bite to eat, having a drink, picking something up, doing some research that they end up picking up later. So I think we're going to see more and more of that leaning into the experience economy for high streets, where it'll be less about I'm coming here just to buy this, but more I'm coming here because this is a really compelling way for me to spend my time, and as a result I'm adding value to the commercial businesses here.
Definitely. How do you think business rates have affected the high street, and what would you like to see happen on those?
Yeah, big question. And I'm on a radio interview in straight after this, and this is a big topic of conversation with Ian Collins as well. So, for me, how's it affected the high street? Well, look, we've always had business rates since I've been around doing anything with high streets. Mm-hmm. So I've always been in an environment where there's been something going on that has been an ongoing challenge to address, evolve, reimagine in some way. Now, the clear thing is that not just business rates, but the wider taxation challenge at the moment, national insurance, the minimum wage is going up. Mm-hmm. It does feel like, as we sit here at the moment, there is a whole bunch of forces coming at once. So what some people may not be aware is that there was a quite significant discount on business rates for small businesses, and this small business rate relief has been reduced. Mm-hmm. It still exists to a degree, but it's been reduced substantially. So what's happening is that businesses' costs are going up from various different sides simultaneously. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, it's about trying to create an environment that gives people the chance of building a great business. And we can do what we're doing with Thriver, great. And that improves the economics on one side, but the challenges exist on the other, where the cost structures are not as favorable as they could be or should be.
And it's got to be sustainable, because no one wants businesses that are open for 6 months and then go under because they can't kind of cope. In the same way that we don't want ridiculously high prices, and it's finding that happy medium, isn't it? Which is obviously quite tricky.
I understand it's tricky, and I empathise as well. We're pragmatists here, not just me, but my whole founding team around what we're doing, and we want to see this work, and we recognise public funding is required. We recognise that just going in there with a big slogan of "Let's go tax the Amazons," it's very easy for people to move their tax liabilities around geographically, and suddenly they're not exposed to anything. Yeah. So it's not as simple as some people would like it to be. Mm-hmm. And I understand that, but change is needed.
Mm-hmm. If you were in power, what would you do? What changes would you bring about?
So, I think for me, and I'm coming here from the perspective of somebody that has spent, a big chunk of my life in this space, and I feel a lot, and I've seized firsthand so often how important that improving high street economies can be. Mm-hmm. I would be investing firstly at the kind of the interventionist level in the short term. So I would be putting more money to work down to local authorities, and then down to those, what I call those local champions, to have the impact they want in the places that they love. You don't need huge amounts of money to give to a local community champion to go and really run with it and inspire them to have a big impact. So I think having dedicated funding for community level activations. So that's the first thing I think is a no-brainer, because it's not huge numbers. The second side of things is I do think we need a revaluation of what we think about when it comes to business rates. Yeah, so they need to make a bigger step change. And so let's see what happens over the next period here. But, there definitely needs to be a change in the legislative and taxation system when it relates to business rates. But I also think some of the changes that are going on with national insurance, they're really hitting from all sides here. Yeah. So there's got to be a wider piece done. And then I think we've got to recognise that, the impact of getting this right has such high societal upside that it's worth putting a lot more money into the initiatives that are focused around making an impact for high streets. Now, SaveTheHighStreet.org is one thing. There are other people out there that are trying to make an impact. And I think incentivizing good actors and good behaviors is something, again, that I think shouldn't break the bank.
Punishing bad ones, yeah.
I really
give the carrot rather than the stick.
Yeah, and actually create an army of people that are trying to entrepreneurially make an impact on high street, whether it's private sector or third sector, whatever it might be. But get that entrepreneurial energy going and stimulate that. That's where I'd go with this.
Fantastic. Alex, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you today. Thanks so much for coming on the show, and hopefully we can get you back on again soon.
Yeah, thank you, Rod.
Brilliant.
It's been good fun.